Let's watch this Marc Lamont Hill
Yeah.
video with Conceptual James before we. It's a little bit longer of a video, but I want to play it because it is interesting the way. I think Marc Lamont Hill, as far as any major media figure, coming into contact with the front lines of what I think is just a new version of like a McCarthyite discourse panic. He's on Black News Tonight. I need to get the channel here. New Discourses. James Lindsay is the founder of New Discourses. So anyway, this is Marc Lamont Hill's show on YouTube here. I'll put this up. And he gets into it with James Lindsay. Again, his name is Conceptual James on Twitter, which I always think is so funny. And he's one of these hatchetmen who's making the panic about CRT and cultural Marxism and all that stuff.
Modernism and everything that any buzzword he can get his hands on.
Yeah, exactly. And now he's confronted with somebody who actually has an understanding of the things he's trying to smear as, like anarchist. I don't want to say that. Like, the interesting thing here is his conclusion from this is that Marc Lamont Hill is a communist because he can tell you what Gramsci was about, right? And that's, from his perspective, this is a mission accomplished for him. Here is this video.
This is one of the things that I find interesting. So under systemic racism, you say when people, progressives, I'm just going to use progressives if you don't mind. When you say progressives say, or social justice people, excuse me, say differences are always due to systems, right? That's not the argument. When we say that there's systemic racism, the argument has never been that every single thing that happens in the world is due to systems. There's always been a relationship between structures or systems and agency, human action. And all of the research literature, all the philosophy, all the theory has been about trying to find a balance and trying to make sense of the relationship between those two things. We're not robots walking through the world. We have choices, we have options. No race theorist argues that we don't. And so the idea here that systemic racism is just some kind of institutional blame game, I think, becomes a kind of caricature of it. I'm going to say one more, and then I want to give you two a chance to respond here. You said that critical race theory says that is the view that all disparities in group outcomes are due to racist systems, right? Again, no. I mean, one of the most enduring, if not the most enduring term from critical race theory has been intersectionality. And so when we look at people like Kimberly Crenshaw and others who talk about the intersections of race and gender and geography and ability status, I think it'd be...
in class.
It's wholly inaccurate to suggest that everything, even in critical race theory, is chalked up to race. How would you respond to those two criticisms?
I mean, the intersectionality one's actually very easy to respond to. Yeah, of course, she's talking about other intersecting systems of power, but all of these systems of power are said to work the same way. And you mentioned structural.
Can I just...
Yeah.
I'm not going to comment on his... He just seems a bit weird to me, but anyway.
So
maybe I'm predisposed to think that.
You did that because structural refers to, in this case, one of two things. Language, as in structuralism, as interpreted through postmodernism, which means that we are actually products of our contingent products of our
sprinting, by the way.
Times.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just sorry, like through like history of philosophy, like sprinting from like structuralism to postmodernism.
You did that because structural refers to, in this case, one of two things. Language, as in structuralism, as interpreted through postmodernism, which means that we are actually products of our contingent products of our culture and times, which therefore means that we don't actually...
And correct me if I'm wrong, is there an intervening stage of like post-structuralism that is central to postmodernism? You don't just go from structuralism to postmodernism, anyway.
An agency that, because we are actually just socialized into the conditions that we're in, and we mistake that which we think is true when it's actually just manifestations of those systems of power. It's also can refer to the structures of society in a Marxian superstructure way, like Karl Marx, as put forth, say, by Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, father of the New Left, who talked about the fact that everybody who doesn't have a critical awakened consciousness, in other words, everybody who's not a critical theorist.
Can we pause it so this doesn't get lost just real quick? It's like Marcuse, this is not a debunk of Marcuse, right? Maybe we can have that conversation later. But Marcuse, yes, is like a Marxist in a sense. But for most like Marxists who actually like still hold true to like class analysis, in my opinion, like Marxism, Marcuse is like actually like one of the beginnings of this really horrendous move away from Marxism proper. So to talk about going from like Marx and like superstructure in like an Althusserian like context to like Marcuse. Sorry for people who have lost here, but it's just like, if you know these things, it's just absurd like how quickly he's jumping, but also trying to lump them all together, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to take 5 different concepts, all these different periods of history, people who vehemently disagree on like basic definitions and framings and conceptions of the world, right? I'm going to jump through all of these debates and then also say they're all the same, right? Which is just, to me, it's absurd.
Yeah. Which, I mean, it's just exactly like...
I'm sorry, but at the same time, who am I to criticize this math PhD who has spent the past 2 years reading all of the literature, as he said in his own words, right?
Right. Yeah, this is just a more higher functioning version of when Peterson was debating Zizek and like glossed the Communist Manifesto.
Race, critical gender, critical queer, critical disability, critical fat, whatever you want to have it, is actually just being influenced in his thought through the heteronymous interests of corporate capitalism and consumerism and the various systems of power, including racism, sexism, etc., that manifest throughout society. So actually, we don't have agency under critical race theory or any of its philosophical antecedents.
That's correct.
So I wish we had more time to unpack.
I like this jackass. I'm sure. I know he's probably talked elsewhere, but he's just like
all of your agency to think otherwise, which is how it chills freedom of thought and freedom of speech, because you have to be critically conscious, or else you have false consciousness and are therefore not acting out yourself. You have no actual agency.
So now are we in start?
So, and of course we're running out of time, but I'm going to respond just so the audience and the people who watch this on clips don't think that I don't have a response. First of all, your counter is predicated on the idea that there's a one-to-one relationship between critical race theory and critical theory as sort of produced from the Marxist tradition, from the Frankfurt School, etc., when in fact critical race theory has certainly connections to any kind of critical intellectual discourse, but it's also connected to critical legal studies, which was not committed to sort of inheriting all of the kind of Gramscian and Marxian sort of ideas that you're talking about. And again, even the type of Marxism you're talking about is a very narrow, thin, sort of crude Marxism, or even what we call vulgar Marxism, which alleges a relationship between economic base and cultural superstructure that is one-to-one, when in fact, what most Marxists have argued, and what certainly most Marxists post the mid part of the 20th century have argued, is that it's a much more complicated dynamic than even Gramsci himself argues at in the prison notebooks about this idea of hegemony and how it happens along a compromise equilibrium, whereby some...
I don't know why
Matt doesn't
absolutely
want to be one.
There we go.
Dynamic that even Gramsci himself argues at in the prison notebooks about this idea of hegemony and how it happens along a compromise equilibrium, whereby some people, or whereby on the one hand we absolutely are hostage to the economic conditions around us, but on the other hand, structures and states and institutions also appeal to our own desires and our own interests and our own needs. It's a much more dynamic and complicated relationship than you're talking about. And as far as sort of structures, again, you're making a connection between structures in terms of institutional structures that I was talking about and the particular type of structures that, say, a Saussure would be talking about in terms of structuralism. That's not actually what I was talking about. And that's not what most people are talking about when they talk about systems and structures. Again, that's a very tight correlation you draw. And if we were to accept that correlation, then sure. But it's not only that we're not accepting it, it's actually not what we're talking about. And postmodernism, again, plays upon a range of things.
Did you catch that? You seem to know a lot about this. I think we've seen enough from this actual exchange here. Again, I think like Marc Lamont Hill, like he got fired by MSNBC for Palestine stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Very few people on that network could have held up as well as he did there, and landed that deal.
I know it's a point that's been said time and time again on social media. It's like, you want to talk about cancel culture, it's like Palestine is one great example of who that's directed at, and that's Black academics trying to fight for freedom for people in Palestine.
Absolutely. And so I just want to bring up on that note what Conceptual James has been up to. I would call him Canceller James because he's trying to cancel Marc Lamont Hill now after being embarrassed by him. Yeah, exactly. Says there's that he's actually a communist and proved it by articulating that he understands the ideology and its roots deeply and yet still supports it. So that's James's takeaway.
Nice.
Marc Lamont Hill. I don't know Marc Lamont Hill's politics, but I wouldn't assume based on that, would you, David, you as an actual communist, that Marc Lamont Hill is a card-carrying commie?
It's exceptional. All the things that this guy Conceptual, James, we'll call him by his dumb name, tries to conflate. It's annoying for me to watch this kind of stuff, right? Because I have serious criticisms of both postmodernism and the kind of becoming dominant version of like thinking about structure and like race in the United States in history, right? Like, and this isn't the time that we'll go through all those, but it's so annoying that this guy is tying together a lot of philosophical and political movements and ways of thinking about the world all together that have severe disagreements with one another. And that's why, Marc Lamont Hill is so great at being able to, try to untether all those things that he tries to package up neatly. I mean, it's so funny to see the way that these guys for me, I make a lot of arguments, for example, that like a lot of what happened in like left philosophy, socialist philosophy, Marxist philosophy, right? At this point, it's hard to even call it that. When you see this kind of like post-Marxist term, right, where they're saying like we're going to like eradicate class, or at least not make class analysis a kind of dominant feature of our philosophy, that was absolutely devastating for the left project, right? So it's funny, I guess what I'm saying is like, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, these movements start to turn their back on like the Marxist project. And it's funny to see these right wingers argue against, basically make the argument that no, this is like the sneaky way that they're trying to reignite it, while knowing that it actually was like this squashed it in a really effective way. And we're trying to breathe life back into those embers.
Right. That is a very funny irony.